So let's talk about shape-shifting. We can usually count on the things that we see to stay pretty much the way that they are. And it seems like words should work that way too. When we pick them out inside of our heads, we figure they're going to spring out into the world the same way each and every time. But our precious little meaning bits get up to some shifty tricks during the dark hours. You have to listen carefully to hear what they really do. I'm Moti Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
So we've talked a couple of times before about morphemes, the smallest pairings between sound and meaning. Our mental dictionary isn't really made up of words. Words are just too big. Instead, it's made out of morphemes. We've got things like nouns and verbs, and also little bits like negation and tense, or changey things like that E that morphs a noun into an adjective. Those are all morphemes. So our brain holds a lot of these entries, and when you learn a new one, you need to encode some vital information into your neurons. You need to know what a morpheme means, and whether it can stand on its own, or if it has to be attached to something else, etc. But another essential thing that we need to learn is how to pronounce it. So let's say that you know that English has a freestanding noun that means a 60-minute time period. If you think that the right way to say that word is whoor, it's not likely that your Anglophone peers are going to agree that you know the word hour. Maybe it's not surprising that the way that you say the word is really important. And a lot of the morphemes in any language that you could care to think of, be it Swiss German, Salish, or Swahili, get pronounced pretty much the same way every time that you say them. Sure, you might say things a little bit differently every time you shoot the words out of your mouth. You won't evoke any eyebrow raising if you say evoke slightly differently one time to the next. There's some natural wiggle room. Chances are really good that you're not actually a robot. But some morphemes go further than this. Some of them really do get pronounced noticeably differently depending on the context where they show up. So what other morphemes they attach to and what sounds they're near. These morphemes are like chameleons. They see who else is around and then they change up their look and sound to try to fit in. We call these environmentally conditioned morpheme pronunciation switch-ups allomorphy. Each version of the morpheme that gets produced is known as an allomorph. Now that term might sound kind of familiar to you. Maybe it reminds you of another allo concept that we talked about back in topic 5 with regard to phonology, the allophone. And they really do have a lot in common. Allophones are different versions of a phoneme that pop out of our mouths depending on what they get pronounced near. If you swap out phoneme for morpheme in that definition, you'd get a pretty good understanding of what allomorphy is. So what's the difference between these two? Well, broadly speaking, the rules that turn phonemes into allophones will always apply to that sound if it's in the right environment. You stick a t at the beginning of a stressed syllable and it's getting aspirated. It could be tower, attack, or taro, but you're always going to get that puff of air. The rules that make allomorphs cause pronunciation changes too, but they're specifically tied to the morpheme that they apply to. Let's look at an example. You probably think that you know the English plural, right? It's that S that you put at the end of a noun, usually. But that's not really true when you think about pronunciation. Sure, you do get that S sound when you put it after a voiceless consonant, like in boats or ports, but you actually get a Z if it comes after a voice sound, like in dogs or cards. And beyond that, if you've got a noisy, hissy sibilant sound at the end of your noun, you actually get a whole extra is, like going from one punch to several punches, or from one dance to some dances. But the changes are tied specifically to the morpheme. You may have to put Z on the end of ab to make abs, but in the middle of a word, you can throw that ab in front of a S sound and be totally fine, like an absent. You don't end up with either absent or absent. The rule's just there for the plural. It has to do with the morpheme and not just the sounds in it. Some of the time, we'll encode this allomorphy into the way that we spell things. Take a look at the prefix in English. This attaches to adjectives and turns them into their opposite. So like if you have direct, throwing that in on the front makes it less straightforward. Now, n and d share the same place of articulation. They're both made by cutting off the airflow at the alveolar ridge. But look at what happens when you pronounce that in front of a labial sound like p. Suddenly that in becomes downright improper. The nasal sound moves forward to get pronounced with the p, and we reflect that in the spelling. But don't get your hopes up too much about spelling again, because it still doesn't show up for the ing that you get in incredible. Or if you're like me, you make a cool labiodental nasal when you put the in front of involuntary, and you don't even do it on purpose. The spelling doesn't capture these, maybe because English doesn't have as many symbols as the IPA, or maybe just because it doesn't care. We can find the exact same variation for another negative prefix on, and none of those get reflected in the spelling either. Unbelievable, unfair, untimely, uncomfortable, and those all get spelled with un. Just remember, even if it helps sometimes, you should never bet on spelling to be helpful. English spelling usually hates you. Before you think that we're just looking at changes where you put one sound up to the next and they influence each other, we should tell you that allomorphy can get pretty extreme. Back on our website, we'll talk about some other examples, but the switchover from one way of realizing a morpheme to another can take, well, all the sounds. This is a process known as suppletion. Let's take a look at an example from Japanese. Now, negation in Japanese is usually pretty straightforward. You take the verb root, you strip the u off the end, and you stick on anai. So manabu, to learn, becomes manabanai, mawaru, to spin, becomes mawaranai, etc. So for the verb to be, aru, you probably would expect something along those lines for negation, like aranai. I mean, we just saw mawaranai, right? But no, when you negate it, you just get nai. All of aru has ceased to be. That's suppletion. But even these extreme examples are driven by rules. You store one base morpheme in your mind, and then you change it over to the appropriate allomorph depending on what it finds itself attached to. So that raises the question, how do we know which allomorph is the underlying form? How do we know what version of the morpheme is stored in your mind and what's generated by rules? And here again we can find a strong similarity to allophones. The one that's going to be the underlying form is the one that appears in the largest number of environments. To see this, let's go back and look at in again so we can solve the mystery of what its underlying form is. In, or ing. Just on the basis of that, it might seem hard. After all, each one has its defined environment. But only in shows up when the following sound doesn't have a place of articulation for the nasal to match. That is, when the following morpheme starts with a vowel. Using any other nasal than n would be inappropriate and inappropriate. That means the n version has the broadest distribution. It shows up before alveolar sounds and also vowels. That determines that it's the underlying form of the morpheme. And sometimes the default allomorph is actually the least likely regular version of the morpheme around. For that, let's take a look at the German plural. This has 5 different allomorphs: n, a, r, s, and nothing. Some words don't change when they become plurals, but this lack of overt sound change still needs to be recorded in the German mental dictionary. So that'd be like Auge turning to Augen, Jahr becoming Jahre, Geist becoming Geister, Auto becoming Autos, and Uncle just staying Uncle. So German has a couple more regular plural allomorphs than English does. But the rules that govern them are rather more complicated. It'd be difficult to give you a complete description of them without making a whole episode just about that. So instead, we've put a link down in the description for those of you who are curious. And depending on how you do your numbers, you'll get different frequency counts for the different allomorphs. But there's no arguing. Of the 5, n is by far the most common, with 42 to 68% of plurals going that route. And s is the least common, getting only 1 to 8% of the plural love. And yet, we want to say that s is actually the default version of the plural. And it's for the same reasons as before. It shows up in the most different environments. If we look at what plural allomorph gets applied to newly coined expressions, or to borrowed words like kinos for movies or chefs for bosses, it's the humble infrequent s that gets called out. When we define a morpheme and we say it's the smallest pairing between sound and meaning, it turns out it doesn't always have to be the exact same sound. There's some patterns of variation there, and our little nuggets of meaning can put on a bunch of different costumes to get the job done. But even if they shift around, if you know the rules, you can work it out. So we've reached the end of the Ling space for this week. If you didn't lose all of your sounds in suppletion, you learned that morphemes vary their pronunciation in a rule-based manner. That the resulting allomorphs range from changing one portion of one sound to all of the sounds in the whole word. And that we can find the default morpheme by seeing what form shows up in the most environments. The Ling space is produced by me, Moti Lieberman. It's directed by Delélise Prévost, and it's written by both of us. Our production assistants are Georges Coulombe and Stéphane Herdebies, our music and sound design is by Shane Turner, and our graphics team is Atelier Muse. We're down in the comments below, or you can bring the discussion back over to our website where we'll have some extra material on this topic. Check us out on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook, and if you want to keep expanding your own personal Ling space, please subscribe. And we'll see you next Wednesday. Ba ma pi mi wa ko up mint.